Hello, what is up, my apes peeps? I hope you are having a great day. We're going to talk about chapter 6 today, population and community ecology.
Today we're going to learn about populations.
There's two different chapters in this unit 3. Chapter 6 is all about populations, and chapter 7 is all about specifically human populations and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that more when we get there. So this is a graphic, and it's showing that nature exists at several different levels of complexity. Okay, so if you look down here at the bottom where it says individual, this is the simplest level, all right, the single organism. Natural selection operates at this level because it's the individual that must survive and reproduce to pass on the genes, okay? The second level of complexity is population. All right, a population is made up of all individuals that belong to the same species and that live in a given area at a particular time. So evolution will also happen here at the population level, okay? The third level of complexity is right here, community. A community incorporates all the populations of organisms within a given area. So just like a population, the boundaries of a community can be defined by like the state or the federal agency responsible for managing it. And scientists who study communities are generally interested in how species interact with one another. Okay, so the interactions between species. Going on up, you've got ecosystem. So communities exist within an ecosystem, which basically consists of the biotic and the abiotic components in a particular location. So ecosystem ecologists study the flows of energy and matter, such as the cycling of nutrients through the system, all the stuff we talked about in chapter 3, the different nutrient cycles and how energy moves through it. Or within it. Good Lord. And then you've got the largest and the most complex systems, all right, that scientists study or environmental scientists study, okay, and that's the biosphere right here. This basically incorporates all of Earth's ecosystems. Usually scientists who study the biosphere are interested in the movement of air, the movement of water, the movement of heat, and all the stuff like that around the globe. So this kind of summarizes everything we learned about in chapter 4 when we talked about weather and climate and the different biomes, okay? Alrighty. So one of the things that you should know and that you should get used to hearing is the fact that populations are dynamic. Remember, dynamic means they're always changing, right? The exact size of a population is the difference between the number of inputs to the population and outputs from the population within a given time, okay? So when we're talking about inputs, we're talking about immigrations and births. When we're talking about outputs, we're talking about emigration and deaths. Make sure you don't get these two terms confused. But basically, if death and emigration exceed birth and immigration, the population is going to go down over time, right? And eventually it could go extinct. So this study of factors that cause populations to go up or to go down is what we call the science of population ecology, okay? So there's a lot of different circumstances in which scientists find it useful to identify the factors that influence population size over time. For example, in the case of the endangered species, such as the California condor, they talk a lot about this in your book. Knowing the factors that affect a species' population size has helped scientists to implement measures to improve its survival and its reproduction. So, another example of that is knowing the different factors that influence the population size of a pest species, right? It can help us to control it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about population characteristics. I will leave my face right here for a second because I don't know where to put it. All right, so there are basically 5 different characteristics that you guys should be familiar with. So population size is pretty simple. It's just the total number of individuals within a defined area at a given time. So how big is the population, right? So population density is strictly the number of individuals per unit area at a given time, okay? So there's a lot of different reasons why we would want to be familiar with the population density of a population, right? Knowing a population's density, in addition to its size, can help scientists to estimate whether a species is rare or abundant. Okay, so an example of this, your book talks about it, would be coyotes, right? In some parts of Texas, they might exist as only 1 per square kilometer, but in other parts of the state, they could be as high as 12 per square kilometer. So it tells us if there's a lot or only a little around. Okay, but scientists also study this population density aspect to determine whether a population in a particular location is so dense that it might outstrip its food supply. Population density can be a particularly useful measure for wildlife managers who must set hunting or fishing limits on a species. Basically, these wildlife managers can offer more hunting or fishing permits for high density zones and less permits for low density zones. In addition to knowing the population size and density of a population, another third thing that's useful for us is to know the population distribution. So population distribution is just a description of how individuals are distributed with respect to one another. Okay, so if you look at this diagram over here, you can see the three different types of population distributions. You should be familiar with these. In some populations, such as a population of trees and natural forests, the distribution of individuals tends to be random. Okay, so you can see right here what the random distribution looks like. The dots are all over the place. There's no rhyme or reason to where they are. So in other populations, like trees in a plantation, the distribution of individuals is uniform. Okay, they plant them uniformly next to each other. In this example here, it's talking about birds, usually with species that are territorial, right? These birds are trying to protect their nests and stay a certain distance away from each other. They tend to uniformly distribute themselves as well, okay? The last thing that you guys need to know is clumped distribution. Sometimes populations are found in these clumped distributions because organisms live in large groups and their feeding opportunities or protection from predators and stuff like that are enhanced by this ability to be clumped together. So a lot of times you'll see stuff like schooling fish, it could be flocking birds, it could be herding animals, those types of things. Those are the three different types of distribution. Another characteristic that you guys need to be familiar with is population sex ratio, which is just the ratio of males to females, okay? In most sexually reproducing species, the sex ratio is usually close to 50-50, right? But in some species, they can be really, really far off from equal. So an example of this is a fig wasp, and there can be as many as 20 females for every male, which is kind of crazy. The last thing that you guys should be familiar with, oops, I shouldn't move that because it moves it away, is the population age structure, how many individuals can fit into particular age categories. So this basically just helps ecologists determine how fast a population can grow. We definitely use these histograms when we talk about human population, so we'll talk more about that in chapter 7. All right. This is just adorable. Maybe you've seen this in my classroom before, but I thought I'd throw it in here. Why science teachers should not be given playground duty. Oh, there you go. Okay, so let's talk about factors that influence population size. There are two different types of factors that we're going to talk about. There is density dependent and density independent. Okay, so the first one is listed right here. It's density dependent factors. So density dependent factors influence an individual's probability of survival and reproduction in a manner that depends on the size of the population. So the amount of available food, for example, is a density dependent factor, right? Because the smaller population requires less total food, food scarcity will have a greater negative effect on the survival and reproduction of individuals in a large population than in a small population, okay? So I'm not going to explain all the details of this graph that's listed right here, but basically there's this Russian biologist dude who did this research on this paramecium. And you can read all about it in your book if you want. He realized from his experiment that food is a limiting resource for many organisms. And you guys know this. You learned about it in biology, a whole bunch, carrying capacity and all that stuff, right? So just like we learned about for plants, right? Nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium are sometimes limiting nutrients for plants, right? They're not going to grow more unless they have those limiting nutrients. The same thing happens in populations with food. If there's not enough food, the population isn't going to grow to be any bigger. So usually when we're talking about animal populations, we're talking about food, water, and nest sites. Those are usually the common limiting resources. So to have a better idea about density dependence, let's consider a situation in which there is a moderate amount of food available for animals to eat. Okay, so at low population densities, only a few individuals share this limiting resource, and each individual has access to sufficient quantities. They have enough food, right? As a result, each individual in the population survives and reproduces well, and the population happens to grow rapidly. Okay, if you have high population densities, though, the opposite, right? Many more individuals have to share the food, so each individual receives a smaller share. And with that smaller share, each individual has a lower probability of surviving, and those that do not survive produce fewer offspring, right? So basically, as a result, the population is going to grow slowly, okay? You're dividing the food up to more organisms in a population. So in this example, the ability to survive and reproduce depends specifically on the density of the population. So that's why it is a density-dependent factor. In this Russian dude's experiment, obviously the limiting resource was food, right? So you would think maybe the population size would increase exponentially and not stop, but there is a limit to how many individuals the food supply could sustain. So we call that limit the carrying capacity. You've definitely heard that word before, right? Knowing the carrying capacity for a species and what the limiting resource is can help us predict how many individuals an environment can sustain. Okay, so this is true whether you're talking about the paramecia, like this guy researched, cows, or even humans. So the other factor that impacts population size is density independent factors. Okay, this is when the size of the population has no effect on the individual's probability of survival. So an example of this would be like a natural disaster, temperature, stuff like that. So a tornado, right? It can uproot and kill a large number of trees in an area. However, a tree's probability of being killed does not depend on whether it resides in a forest with high or low density of other trees. Okay, no matter what, if a storm goes through, a tornado or something like that, it's going to kill all of them. It's not dependent on the population density of the trees. Other density independent factors could be like hurricanes, floods, fires. It could be volcanic eruptions, other climatic events. Okay, so let's talk about some different growth models. Usually scientists use models to help explain how things work and how to predict how things might change in the future. Okay, population ecologists use these population growth models that incorporate density dependent and density independent factors to explain and predict the changes in population size. So these population growth models we're going to look at are basically just mathematical equations that can be used to predict population size at any moment in time. Under ideal conditions with unlimited resources available, every population has a particular maximum potential for growth, which is called the intrinsic growth rate. Okay. When there's plenty of food available, for example, white-tailed deer give birth to 2 fawns, domesticated hogs can have litters of 10 piglets, and American bullfrogs can lay up to 20,000 eggs, right? So under these ideal conditions, the number of deaths also decreases. When resources are limited, the population's growth rate will be lower than its intrinsic growth rate because individuals will produce fewer offspring and the number of deaths will increase. So if we know the intrinsic growth rate of a population and the number of reproducing individuals that are currently in the population, we can estimate the population's future size after some time. If some time has passed, to do this, we can use the exponential growth model. We need to be able to calculate anything using this equation, but you need to know what the equation tells us, right? So the equation tells us that under ideal conditions, the future size of the population depends on the current size of the population, the intrinsic growth rate of the population, and the amount of time over which the population grows. Okay, so when populations aren't limited by resources, their growth can be very rapid as more births occur with each step in time. So when you graph this, the exponential growth model produces this J-shaped curve, just like this. Okay, so we call that a J-shaped curve. Pretty straightforward, right? So exponential growth is density independent because no matter how many organisms you have in a population, the number is going to grow by the same percentage every year. Okay, so that's why the exponential growth model is a really, really good starting point for understanding population growth. So one thing we do know is that no population experiencing exponential growth can grow indefinitely, right? It's eventually going to stop because that population is going to reach carrying capacity and their growth is going to slow and level off. Right? That's why we have another model of population growth because it gives us a more complete view. So let's look at that one. It's called the logistic growth model. Ecologists have modified the exponential growth model to incorporate these environmental limits on population growth, which include limiting resources and stuff like that. So the logistic growth model describes a population whose growth is initially exponential. You can see right here, kind of the J shape, but it slows as the population approaches the carrying capacity of the environment. So as you can see right here, if you're looking at the graph, if the population starts out small, right, there's a low population density, so the growth can be really rapid. But as it gets to, about 1/2 of the carrying capacity around here or so, the population's growth begins slow, like it says here. And as the population size approaches this carrying capacity, eventually the population is going to stop growing. All right, so when we graph it, it looks like this S-shaped curve. Okay, so that's why you guys need to be familiar with this S-shaped curve. When graphed, the logistic growth model produces an S. All right, so we use this logistic growth model to predict the growth of populations that are subject to density-dependent traits, such as increased competition for food, increased competition for water, nest sites, etc., as a population grows. Okay, because density independent factors like hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, whatever, are super unpredictable. The logistic growth model does not account for those. Okay, so it's not taking into account these natural disasters. Kiba, do you want to be my video?
Kiba. Kiba, can you smile? Can you smile for my students? Can you say hi?
So one of the assumptions of the logistic growth model that we just talked about is that the number of offspring individuals produce depends on the current population size and the carrying capacity of the environment, right? So one thing you might know is that many species of mammals mate during the fall or the winter, and the number of offspring that develops depends on the food supply at the time of mating, okay? Because the offspring are not actually born until the following spring, there's a risk that the food availability will not match the new population size. So if there's less food available in the spring than needed to feed the offspring, the population is going to experience an overshoot. This is a vocab word that you guys should be familiar with, by becoming larger than the spring carrying capacity can support. All right, so as a result, there's not going to be enough food for all these individuals in the population, and the population will experience a die. So far, I've only been talking about how populations are limited by resources like food, water, and nesting sites. But predation is another really important thing that plays a really big role in limiting population growth. There's a really good example in your book talking about snowshoe hares and lynx, so you guys should check that graph out when you're going through and doing your reading guide. Here's another one of these funny face swaps. Okay, let's talk about some reproductive strategies. We have a whole lab that we're going to do about this in class. So obviously, population size increases by reproduction, right? So population ecologists are researching this, and they've identified a wide range of reproductive strategies in nature. So that's what we're going to talk about. All right, some species have a really low intrinsic growth rate, which causes their populations to increase slowly until they reach the carrying capacity of an environment. As a result of this, essentially the abundance of such species is determined by the carrying capacity, and their population fluctuations are small. We call these species K-selected species. So K-selected species have certain traits in common. Usually K-selected animals are typically large organisms that reach reproductive maturity relatively late. They usually produce just a few large offspring, and they provide lots and lots of parental care. All right. Elephants are an example of this. They don't really become reproductively mature until they're like 13 years old. They have a baby every 2 to 4 years or so, and they can only have one calf at a time. Most large mammals and most birds are usually going to be K-selected species. Sometimes it's really hard for environmental scientists who are interested in biodiversity management protection to research these types of species because their populations grow really slowly. There are a lot of endangered K-selected species that can't respond quickly to efforts to save it from extinction, so that's a problem, right? So we also have these types of species that are at the opposite end of the spectrum that have a high intrinsic growth rate because they reproduce really often and they reproduce large numbers of offspring. We call these species R-selected species. Okay, so in contrast to these K-selected species, the population of R-selected species do not typically remain near the carrying capacity, but instead they show really, really rapid population growth that's often followed by overshoots and die-offs. So among animals, these R-selected species tend to be small organisms that reach reproductive maturity relatively early. They reproduce really frequently, right? They produce lots of small offspring, and they provide little or no parental care to their offspring, okay? So they have the babies, a whole bunch of babies, and they just let them go. A really good example of this is house mice, because they become reproductively mature at 6 weeks of age. They can breed every 5 weeks, and they can have at least a dozen babies every time they reproduce. Some other common organisms that would be included under this R-selected species realm would be like small fish, insects, weedy plant species, stuff like that. Also, lots of organisms that humans consider to be pests and stuff, like cockroaches, dandelions, rats. All of these species are usually going to be R-selected species. Here you go. Here's a table. It's just summarizing the different traits of the K-selected and R-selected species. Make sure you're familiar with these. Basically, the two concepts represent, opposite ends of a really wide spectrum of reproductive strategies. So most of the species are going to fall somewhere in between these two extremes. And a lot of them are going to exhibit combinations of traits from these two different extremes, right? So an example of this would be something like a bluefin tuna, okay? It takes them a long time to reach reproductive maturity, which would be a K-selected species trait. But once they do reach that reproductive maturity, they have tons and tons of offspring, millions of offsprings that don't receive any parental care, which is an R-selected species trait. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot more about this in class because we have a lab that we do that goes along with it. So in addition to these different reproductive strategies, these species have distinct patterns of survival over time. All right, so these patterns can be plotted on a graph as survivorship curves. That's what this is showing right here. K-selected species like elephants, whales, and humans, they have really high survival rates throughout most of their lifespan. But as they approach old age, however, they start to die in large numbers. Okay, so this pattern is called a type 1 survivorship curve. Or you can see here, they're living, and then we die. R-selected species like mosquitoes, dandelions, stuff like that, they have low survivorship earlier in life and few individuals reach adulthood. So we call that pattern a type 3 survivorship curve. So you can see this right here. Okay, you have really high numbers, they die, and then you have very few that make it to old age. Lots of other species kind of fit somewhere in between, maybe like corals, squirrels, something like that. So you can see they start really high here and then they go down. It's pretty constant. We call this a type 2 survivorship curve. Okay, here's your last slide for today. All right, this is all about metapopulations. A metapopulation is a group of populations that are separated by space but consist of the same species. So these spatially separated populations interact as individual members move from one population to another. A really good example of this is cougar populations, okay? There are lots of different pockets of cougars that live all around like the southwestern United States, and they're considered to be in different populations, but they're all the same species. So all of those populations combined, we call a metapopulation. All right, so even if those populations could get together with each other, those cougars could still mate, obviously, because they're the same species. So usually what happens here is there's some sort of geographic barrier, usually because of humans, whether we build a shopping mall or whatever it may be, that separates these populations from each other, and that's how it starts. Okay, here's your riddle for the day, folks. It says, a girl has as many brothers as sisters, but each brother has only half as many brothers as sisters. How many brothers and sisters, ooh, I got a typo, are there in the family? Okay, so we'll see if you guys can get that one. Present. All right, so I hope that you all have a fantabulous day, and I will see you in class next time. Toodaloo!